In the last episode we got the engine fitted up to the engine mounts, and in this episode we go from a bare engine just sitting there to something that looks a little bit more like the finished product. But before we get to this point, the first thing I need to do is get the gearbox in, and to do that we need to fit the transfer case adapter. The kit mark supplies for this one consist of these three components. The seal presses into that recessed lip, and on the 6L80 itself you need to remove the extension housing and the rubber donut. Once that's removed you need to cut down the main shaft as per the instructions supplied. Once the seal is installed, coat both flanges with silicone evenly and install the spline adapter. Once you have the spline adapter on, all that's left to do is bolt the two together. Now the adapter is bolted up to the gearbox. I've coated both flanges with silicone, and then all that's left is to bolt these two together as well. Now I've got the transfer case bolted up to the adapter, the whole unit's complete and ready to go in. This is what's left over after it's complete, and it's important when you fit the adapter that you don't use this O-ring, only silicone is required. Also, this adapter kit requires the use of a manual cross member. You can see the difference in the centre where the mount holes line up. This moves the transfer case back, so we will need different tail shafts, but we'll go through that later. Now we've got the gearbox and cross member bolted up, we're going to fit the exhaust. Mark supply an extractor kit and a cat back in both mild and stainless. They come with this style gasket, but put that straight in the bin and get yourself a set of MLS gaskets or you'll be changing them every 12 months. In my opinion, it's worth paying a little bit extra for the stainless as it lasts much longer. Because this is a 6 litre, we do need to modify the coil pack to fit the alternator. It's as simple as cutting this end coil off and using the brackets above. Also, while I got plenty of room, I'm going to fit the aircon compressor. I always fit the manifold to the pump first because it's a pain to get to while it's in there. Next up is the power steering hoses. I'm going to take the stock VE power steering hose and the Patrol power steering hose and cut the ends off them. This is leftover stuff that we don't actually need. What I do want from these two hoses is the other two ends here. I'll take these two ends and bolt it to the steering box and the power steering pump. With the two ends bolted up, I've taken some scrap rubber hose and run it down where I want the new power steering line to be. This way I know exactly how long it needs to be for the hose doctor to make up the new hose. So now I know how long I want it to be, I'll send it down the hose doctor, and on this end I'll put a little right angle with a swivel just to make it neat. And this is the finished hose. I got them to fit a right angle with a swivel at the bottom so I can turn that top piece around to match where the pump sits. And with all that said, let's have a look at these parts we just fitted. First up we have the AC compressor. You can see why I said to bolt that manifold on before. Getting to that Allen key up against the chassis rail isn't much fun. Then we move on to the power steering line. I've run that down alongside the return line and up through the swivel to the power steering pump. and I've also run the return line through the stock power steering cooler. Mark supplied the piece of power steering feed hose for the reservoir, and that just sits on that bracket that bolts up on top of the coil pack, and you can also see the relocated coil pack at the front behind the alternator. When it comes to Thermo Fans, the aftermarket ones just don't seem to do a very good job. So use the V8, VT, VX Thermo Fans and then graft that into the stock fan shroud for a nice tight fit against the radiator. So I start with the Commodore Thermos and I cut the top and the bottom lip completely off so it sits flush against the Patrol fan shroud. As for the Patrol fan shroud, I cut out the centre alongside those two large holes and flush against the mating surface of the radiator. And some small pockets for the factory mounting points of the Commodore Thermo Fans. You can see how the two pieces fit together quite nicely. Make sure when I cut it out I get all the gaps nice and tight. And all that's left to do is to seal it all up with some sticker flex. So I've glued both pieces together with sticker flex now and gone around the outside and filled up any gaps that I could find. It doesn't look great now, but once it's dry I'll come back and clean it up with a razor blade. With the front side dry, I've now flipped it over and glued up the inside. You can see the Patrol fan shroud is almost the perfect size to take the Commodore Thermo Fans. And once I clean up all this sticker flex with a razor blade, it'll look almost factory. While I'm waiting for that to dry, we'll get all these hoses sorted out. The top hose is from a VZ Commodore and the two bottom hoses from VT to VY. Use the McKay part numbers if you need them. I'm also using the factory crossover pipe from VT to VY. I'm also using a temp sensor adapter for the bleed pipe on the heads. And to plumb that up, we just need a little brass fitting and some 8mm heater hose. As for the heater hose, I'm just using a 3m length of 16mm hose with a brass T-piece and some P-clamps. And that should be all I need to plumb up the cooling system. The factory Commodore crossover pipe bolts straight up to where the power steering return line bolts to. The factory Commodore bottom hose is slightly too long for the application here, so I need to trim a little bit off the end there so it sits behind that rib. And on the other side it's just a simple right angle. If you take the hose and try and cut it down so it fits on this way, it'll be too short and it won't reach the radiator. So flip the hose over and just cut it down this way. I've cut the VZ top hose in half and fitted the bypass adapter with a bleed pipe that runs up to the heads. You can see what that bottom hose looks like when it's chopped down. I've also run a length of heater hose from the bypass adapter up to the coolant reservoir, and from the other side of the bypass adapter up to the brass T-piece in the heater hoses. And both of the heater hoses run alongside the battery box and up to the firewall. And that's all the hoses on the cooling system done. I just need to take the top hose back off and fit the Thermo Fans, and we're one step closer. Now I've got the Thermo Fans in, I put the top hose back on along with the bleed pipe for the coolant reservoir. You can see the Thermo Fans sit in there quite nicely, and they just bolt up to the radiator from the 3 points at the top. While I was here I cut down the factory Commodore brake booster hose and joined it up to the Patrol brake booster line with this non-return valve. It's just a simple one-way valve with a ball bearing and spring. You can pick them up fairly cheap. And with that and all the cooling system done now, we'll move on to doing the air conditioning lines. This is the hose kit that Mark's Adapter supplies. It's quite a neat little kit and it saves me going and getting hoses made up for them. The main hard line you're seeing goes from the firewall down underneath the battery tray and it joins onto the larger flexi line. And you run the other end of the flexi line over to the compressor manifold. The smaller flexi line runs from the compressor manifold up to that other shorter hard line that goes into the AC condenser. And that's all there is to the AC lines. So next we're going to move on to the fuel system. So first of all we need to get the fuel tanks out and wash all the old diesel out of them. As per usual they're covered in an inch of dirt, so I'll take them out the back and give them a wash. They both came up reasonably clean. Now I just need to remove the senders and clean all of the old diesel out. Now I've got the main tank sender out. Because it is a diesel, I'll have to cut down the pickup tube to mount the fuel pump and add a pass-through for the main power. With the pump secure to the return line tube, I run the main power up through the pass-through and I run an extra earth on one of the sender bolts. I've got both tanks cleaned out and the senders back in. I've also replaced the diesel line for some new EFI line, and I've also mounted the fuel regulator up on the chassis rail. The two bottom ports are pressure and the top is return. Before I bolt the fuel tanks back in, we'll go over the differences between the auto and the manual tail shafts. Because the transfer case has been moved back, you can see the front shaft is longer than the auto one, and the rear shaft is shorter. Before I bolted both tanks in, I blew all the fuel lines out and make sure there wasn't any diesel left in them. And you can see the fuel regulator bolted up alongside the main tank here. The only thing you need to do to the sub tank is wash it out, and it just retains the factory operation. I got both tail shafts back in. Of course, one of the cross member bolts was rusted out in the snap, so I got to drill that back out. And I still need to make a shifter cable and brackets, but we'll do that in the next video. Now as for the fuel lines in the engine bay, the main line still feeds the rail through the 10mm hose, and we use the old return line as a vapour hose that goes over to the carbon canister. I've mounted the carbon canister in a spare spot over here in the corner, and the other line from the canister just runs over to the purge solenoid. And that's all the fuel system plumbed up. The only thing I need to do now is to set the fuel pressure, but I can't do that till I wire it up. So for now, I'm going to move on to doing the snorkel. So I'm going to start by removing the guard so I can cut the hole for the airbox. This is the kit the customer supplied. It comes with all of the pipe and bends that you need. Quite a nice looking airbox and lid with a huge pod filter and all of the hardware and weather stripping that you need. This kit comes with twin snorkels, but only one of them gets plumbed up to the airbox. So once I get that hole cut, we'll get all this stuff installed and see how it looks. I've still got the right angle I normally use on the throttle body, and I'm going to swap that out for the longer one that is supplied with the kit. And I had no problems fitting the airbox, it was a perfect fit. Once I've got the right angle swapped over, I'll cut down this bend and join the two together. With the hole cut in the inner guard, it just uses this right angle to plumb up the rest of the snorkel. I'll refit the passenger guard now and cut holes in both of them, and we'll get the snorkels fitted and see what it looks like. I swapped over the right angle piece of silicone that they supplied, which moved the MAF sensor over a little bit, and joined that to the airbox with the cut down 45. And I've got both of the snorkels bolted up to the pillars, and took my time to make sure they're both symmetrical. But that's all I've got time for in this video. In the next one we'll go over the shifter cable, transmission cooler, wiring, dyno tune and all the rest. Well, that's it for now. Once again, thanks for watching.